The dispatch manager laughed at his '53 Mack. 30 years later, that truck pulled his whole fleet out of business. On a Tuesday morning in March of 1961, a 24-year-old named Ellis Boone drove a 1953 Mack B-61 into the parking lot of Central Midwest Freight in Terre Haute, Indiana, and asked to speak with the contract's manager. The receptionist looked at him, then she looked out the window at the truck, then she looked back at him. "Do you have an appointment?" "No, ma'am, I have a truck." She made a phone call. 5 minutes later, a man named Gerald Purcell came through the frosted glass door that separated the lobby from the offices. Gerald was 47 years old, Regional Operations Director for Central Midwest, which was at that time the largest independent freight carrier in the tri-state area. He wore a tie every day, including Saturdays. He had a company car, a new Buick, and a corner office, and the particular confidence of a man who has spent 20 years building something and wants everyone in the room to know it. He looked at Ellis. He looked out the window at the Mack. Then he laughed. Not a chuckle, not a polite smile. A full laugh, the kind that fills a lobby and doesn't apologize for itself. "Son," Gerald said, "I retired 3 of those last fall, sent them to the scrapper. You drove that thing here to ask me for a contract." "Yes, sir." "On what route?" "Whatever you need covered. I'll drive anything, any distance, any schedule." Gerald looked at him for a moment with the expression of a man deciding whether something is worth his time. "I've got 42 trucks," Gerald said. "Brand new Peterbilts, every one of them. Air rides, sleeper cabs, the works. My drivers don't break down. My loads don't arrive late. My customers don't call twice." He gestured toward the parking lot. "That thing out there is older than some of my drivers. I can't put a customer's freight on a 1953 Mack and tell them it'll be there Thursday. I'd be a laughingstock." Ellis didn't say anything. "You want some advice?" Gerald continued. "Go find something with a current model year on it. Come back when you've got a real truck. I'll talk to you then." Ellis nodded once. He walked back through the lobby door, got in the Mack, and drove out of the Central Midwest Freight parking lot. Gerald watched him go from the window. Then he went back to his office. He didn't think about Ellis Boone again for 11 years. Let me tell you about the Mack B-61. Because to understand why Ellis drove that truck into Gerald Purcell's parking lot, and why he kept driving it for the next 3 decades, you need to understand what that truck was and what it meant to the man who inherited it. The Mack B series was introduced in 1953 and built until 1966. It was not the most powerful truck of its era. It was not the fastest. It did not have the longest range or the most advanced suspension or the smoothest cab. What it had, what every man who ever drove one remembers, was a quality that the industry had a technical name for and that drivers had a simpler name for. The technical name was powertrain durability. The drivers called it honest. The B-61 was built around the Thermodyne diesel engine, a straight-six that produced 180 horsepower and a torque curve that peaked low and stayed there, not flashy, not dramatic, just a steady pull that didn't waver under load. The transmission was a 10-speed Fuller Road Ranger, mechanical, no assist, nothing between the driver's hand and the gears except steel and oil. The frame was ladder steel, riveted at the joints, overbuilt by any rational measure. Mack engineers in the early 1950s designed their trucks on the assumption that they would be worked hard and maintained by whoever happened to be available, and that they needed to survive both conditions indefinitely. They were right. The B-61s that were maintained, not bobbied, not overhauled every season, just maintained, ran for decades without structural failure. The engines were rebuilt, but the frames lasted. The cabs rusted, but the drivetrains held. Men who drove B-61s in the 1950s were still driving the same trucks in the 1970s, and the trucks were still earning their keep. Ellis's father, Harlan Boone, had bought the B-61 new in 1953. He'd run it for 8 years on the Illinois-Indiana corridor, farm equipment, grain, building materials, the ordinary freight of a post-war Midwest that was rebuilding itself as fast as it could. Harlan was not a fleet man. He was never going to be a fleet man. He owned one truck and he drove it himself and he was good at it, and that was enough. Harlan died in 1960. Heart attack. He was 51 years old. He left Ellis the truck, the toolbox in the garage, and a logbook with 8 years of routes and customers and notes written in the margins in the handwriting of a man who believed that details mattered. Ellis was 23. He had been driving with his father since he was 16. He knew the truck and he knew the routes, and he knew that what his father had built, small, unglamorous, debt-free, was exactly what he wanted to build for himself. He spent the winter of 1960 going through the Mack systematically. Not because it needed a full rebuild, it didn't, but because he wanted to know every inch of what he was inheriting. He pulled the heads, checked the bores, resealed the transmission, replaced the rear axle seals and the front wheel bearings and the brake shoes all around, painted the cab in the original Mack red, one coat, brush applied, which was not beautiful but which sealed the metal and cost $12. By March of 1961, the truck was as solid as it had been the day Harlan drove it off the dealer's lot. Then Ellis drove it to Central Midwest Freight, and Gerald Purcell laughed at it. Ellis went home. He called 3 of the customers his father had listed in the logbook: small manufacturers, a farm co-op, a building supply company, and asked if they needed anything moved. 2 of them said yes. He ran those loads. He was on time. The freight arrived undamaged. He charged a rate that was slightly below what the larger carriers were asking, not because he was desperate but because his overhead was low, one truck, no employees, a garage at home, and because he understood that the way to build a customer base when you have one truck is to give people a reason to call you back. They called him back. By the end of 1961, Ellis had 6 regular customers. By the end of 1963, he had 14. He was running the Mack 6 days a week, sometimes 7, sleeping in the cab on the longer runs, eating at truck stops that knew him by name. He did not hire drivers. He did not buy a second truck. He did not take out a loan. This was a deliberate decision, and it was one that people in the industry, the dispatchers, the fleet managers, the men like Gerald Purcell who measured success in the number of units on the road, did not understand and did not respect. You had to grow. That was the logic of the business. You had to add capacity. You had to leverage your customer base into expansion. Standing still was the same as going backward. Ellis had a different view. He'd watched his father run one truck for 8 years and never miss a payment and never miss a delivery, and never once wake up at 3 in the morning worrying about whether the bank was going to call. He'd watched the men his father knew, the ones with 3 trucks, 5 trucks, 10 trucks, spend their lives chasing the cash flow to service the debt they'd taken on to buy the trucks they needed to generate the cash flow to service the debt. One truck, one driver, no debt. That was the whole plan. Now let me tell you about Gerald Purcell, because his story runs alongside Ellis's for 20 years, and you need both to understand what happened in 1982. After Ellis left his parking lot in 1961, Gerald kept building. He was good at it. He understood the freight business, the routes, the rates, the customer relationships, the regulatory environment. He added trucks methodically. By 1965, he had 62. By 1970, 89. Central Midwest Freight was the dominant carrier in the tri-state area, with contracts from 3 major manufacturers and a reputation for reliability that was genuinely earned. Gerald made money, real money. He moved to a bigger house. He sent his kids to good schools. He joined the right clubs and sat on the right boards and became exactly the kind of man he had always intended to become. But the growth required debt. Not reckless debt. Gerald was not a reckless man, but the steady, compounding debt of a business that grows by acquiring capital equipment. Each new Peterbilt was financed. The maintenance facility was mortgaged. The fuel contracts were leveraged against future receivables. This was normal. This was how the freight business worked. Every carrier of any size operated this way. The interest rates in the 1960s were manageable. The economy was growing. Freight volumes were rising. The model made sense. Then the 1970s arrived. The oil embargo of 1973 hit the freight industry like a physical blow. Fuel costs doubled and then doubled again. Carriers that had been profitable on thin margins suddenly weren't. Some adapted. Some didn't. Gerald adapted. He raised rates, renegotiated contracts, cut routes that no longer penciled out. He was, as always, competent. He survived the 1970s. But surviving the 1970s required carrying more debt into the 1980s than he had carried into the 1970s. The maintenance facility refinancing. The truck replacements that couldn't wait. The expanded terminal he'd built in 1977 on the assumption that freight volumes would keep growing. They didn't, not the way the projections had assumed. By 1980, Central Midwest Freight was profitable but fragile. A good year looked fine. A bad quarter exposed how thin the margin between the revenue and the debt service really was. Gerald knew this. He didn't know how to stop it. The logic of the business required him to keep running, keep growing, keep servicing contracts. You couldn't shrink your way to safety in the freight business. You could only grow fast enough to stay ahead of what you owed. Ellis Boone, running his one truck in 1980, owed nothing. Let me tell you about the summer of 1972, because this is where the two men's stories intersect for the second time, and where something is said that matters. Ellis was making a delivery to a manufacturer in Terre Haute, a company that had been on his customer list for 4 years. He was backing the Mack into the loading dock when the dock supervisor came out and told him that Central Midwest Freight had approached the company about taking over the contract. Larger carrier, more capacity, guaranteed same-day availability. Ellis drove back to his garage and thought about it for a day. Then he called the manufacturer's purchasing manager and asked for a meeting. He didn't ask for a contract guarantee. He didn't undercut his rate. He brought his logbook, the one his father had started in 1953 and Ellis had continued, and he showed the purchasing manager 11 years of on-time deliveries. Every load, every date, every contact name. 11 years without a missed window. "I've got one truck," Ellis said. "When you call, I answer. When I take a load, it gets there. I can't offer you a backup fleet. I can offer you a driver who has never once left a customer waiting." The purchasing manager kept the contract with Ellis. 2 months later, Ellis was fueling at a truck stop outside Terre Haute when Gerald Purcell pulled in with one of his Peterbilts. Not driving it himself. Gerald hadn't driven since 1965, but riding along on some kind of inspection run. Gerald recognized the Mack. He walked over. "Still got that old thing running," Gerald said. It wasn't quite a question. "Yes, sir." Gerald looked the truck over. The cab was worn. The red paint had faded in patches, but the tires were good and the frame was clean, and the engine idled with the steady, unhurried rhythm of a well-maintained diesel. "How many miles on it?" "Coming up on 400,000. Gerald shook his head slowly, not mockingly, more like a man confronting arithmetic he hadn't expected. 400,000 miles on a 1953 Mack. "She's got more in her." Gerald looked at Ellis. Then he looked at his own Peterbilt, 5 years old, still clean, still modern. "You ever think about expanding? Second truck, maybe?" "No, sir." "You're leaving money on the table." "I'm keeping what I earn," Ellis said. "That's enough." Gerald considered that for a moment. Then he nodded, not in agreement exactly, but in the way a man nods when he recognizes a position he doesn't share but can't immediately argue with. He got back in his Peterbilt and drove out of the truck stop. Ellis finished fueling the Mack and drove back onto the highway. The 1980s farm crisis hit the Midwest like a slow-motion catastrophe. If you know the history, you know what happened. Interest rates climbed to 21%. Land values collapsed. Farmers who had borrowed against inflated land prices found themselves underwater. The manufacturing base that had grown up to serve the agricultural economy contracted with it. For the freight industry, the crisis expressed itself in falling volumes and clients who couldn't pay on time and contracts that were renegotiated or canceled outright. The carriers that had expanded through the 1970s on borrowed money found themselves in the same position as the farmers, servicing debt that made sense when volumes were growing and didn't make sense when they weren't. Gerald Purcell had been fighting this since 1980. By 1982, he was losing. Not catastrophically, not all at once. This was not a man who made dramatic errors. It was the steady arithmetic of a business model that required growth to service its own debt. Confronting an economy that had stopped growing. Every month the gap between revenue and debt service was a little wider. Every refinancing bought a little less time. In the spring of 1982, Central Midwest Freight began losing contracts. Not to bigger carriers, the bigger carriers were in the same position. The contracts were going to smaller operators. Men with 1 truck, 2 trucks, no debt, low overhead, rates that made sense in a contracting market. Men who could afford to take a load at a price that Central Midwest, with its fleet and its facility and its payroll, simply could not cover. Gerald fought it. He cut staff. He sold the terminal he'd built in 1977. He refinanced again. He sold 12 trucks and paid down the most expensive debt. It wasn't enough. In August of 1982, Central Midwest Freight filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. 81 trucks, 112 employees, 21 years of Gerald Purcell's working life. The phone call came on a Wednesday morning in September. Ellis was in his garage doing a valve adjustment on the Mack. It was coming up on 500,000 miles and he was going through it carefully, the way he went through it every year. The phone rang in the shop. He wiped his hands and answered. Ellis Boone. Speaking. This is Gerald Purcell. I don't know if you remember me. I remember you. A pause. I imagine you've heard about Central Midwest. I heard. Another pause, longer this time. I've got 3 customers asking me who they should use for the Terre Haute to Indianapolis corridor. Regular runs, good freight, established relationships. I told them I'd make some calls. Gerald's voice was careful and controlled, the voice of a man who has rehearsed this. I thought of you. Ellis didn't say anything. I know we didn't start on the best terms, Gerald said. I said some things in 1961 that weren't. I wasn't wrong about the business logic, but I was wrong about the man. And the truck. A pause. You've been running that Mack for 30 years and you're still running it, and I've got 81 trucks in a bankruptcy proceeding. That tells me something. Ellis looked out the garage door at the Mack in the driveway. 30 years old now. The red paint long gone, replaced twice. The engine rebuilt at 350,000 miles and again at 450. The frame original, sound, straight. The truck his father had driven new off the lot in 1953. I'll take the calls, Ellis said. He talked to the 3 customers. He took 2 of the contracts. One he couldn't fit in his schedule. One he passed to a driver he knew who was looking for work. The 2 contracts he took, he ran on time. Every load, every window, every delivery. In October of 1982, Gerald Purcell came to Ellis's garage. Not for business. The business had already been handled by phone. He came because there was something he needed to say in person. Ellis was under the Mack doing a brake inspection when Gerald's car pulled up. He slid out, stood up, wiped his hands. Gerald looked at the truck for a long moment. Up close, with 30 years on it, The Mack had the presence that old working machines acquire when they've been properly kept, not beautiful, not restored, just used and maintained and still capable, which is a kind of beauty that has nothing to do with appearance. "I said you'd be a laughingstock," Gerald said, "putting a customer's freight on a 1953 Mack and telling them it'd be there Thursday." Ellis waited. "You weren't the laughingstock." Ellis nodded once. Gerald put his hand out. Ellis shook it. "How much longer do you think she's got?" Gerald asked, nodding at the truck. Ellis looked at the Mack, thought about it. "As long as I keep doing what needs to be done," he said. "Same as always." Gerald nodded. He got back in his car and drove out of the driveway, and Ellis didn't see him again for several years. Ellis Boone ran that 1953 Mack B-61 until 1991, 38 years, just over 600,000 miles on the original frame. The engine had been rebuilt 3 times. The cab had been replaced once after a minor collision in 1974. The transmission had been overhauled twice. He retired that year, not because the truck gave out, but because his knees did the climbing in and out, twice a day, 30 years of it, had been harder on his joints than on the Thermodyne diesel. He sold the routes to a younger man who'd been working the same corridor for 5 years and knew the customers and knew the territory. He kept the truck. It's in his garage in Terre Haute now. Not running. Ellis's son has been talking about a restoration for 3 years and getting around to it slowly, the way these things happen. The frame is sound. The engine turns over by hand. The logbook, Ellis's father's handwriting in the first 100 pages, Ellis's own for the 430 pages after that, sits on the shelf above the workbench. Gerald Purcell spent 2 years restructuring Central Midwest Freight and eventually sold it to a regional carrier in 1984. He retired to Florida. By all accounts, he was a good man who built a real business and was honest about what had brought it down when it came down. He was right about the business logic in 1961. A 1-truck operation couldn't compete with a 42-truck fleet for major contracts, couldn't offer the capacity or the redundancy or the guaranteed availability that large shippers required. That was true. What he didn't account for was the other kind of competition. The competition that isn't about capacity or contracts or the number of units on the road. The competition that plays out over decades, in the accounting of who owes what to whom when the market turns, in the question of whether a man can service his debt when the freight volumes that were supposed to make that possible decide to go somewhere else. 1 truck, 1 driver, no debt. Gerald had called it leaving money on the table. Ellis had called it keeping what he earned. Over 30 years, across a farm crisis and 2 recessions and a bankruptcy, and 3 phone calls from a man who had laughed in 1961 and called in 1982, the difference between those 2 descriptions turned out to matter more than either of them knew. The Mack was still in the driveway when Gerald called. That was the whole story, and both men knew it. Some trucks outlast the fleets that laughed at them. Some plans are vindicated not by the money they made, but by the money they didn't have to owe. And some laughs, given in the lobby of a freight company on a Tuesday morning in March, take 30 years to finish, quietly, without drama, with a handshake in a driveway and a truck that was still running because the man who drove it never once confused what he owed with what he owned.